Chuck, how's it looking?
No sign of Prefectura assets in the immediate environment. This is an imprecise analysis. It may be best to stay as quiet as possible.
Quiet is great, but sometimes, a little noise is also nice, some conversation back and forth, keeps things interesting. Yeah. Like in movies, so like at first all there was silence. But then somebody figured out the whole sound thing and everything changed. I mean, take the horror genre, for example.
Okay.
Then, everything changed. Sound roared onto the scene, turning the medium on its head. Modern cinema was born. Horror came into its own as a genre now, too. For the first time, a scream was more than a mouth stretched wide. And where would the genre be without all those other iconic sounds that every horror fan and film buff knows by heart? Where would cinema be? But wall-to-wall sound quickly becomes just noise. Sometimes we need the quiet.
Sally, I hear something. Stop! Stop!
It's like with everything else in film. Contrast is key. Silence and sound glide back and forth in an endless and endlessly variable dance. We're all familiar with its most common variation.
Mike? Nanook?
Sounds fade until they're nearly inaudible, and right away, we're on edge. Anticipating. Vulnerable. We're cave people, listening to the night as all the crickets fall silent. Something's coming. The dance took some time to master. Even today, not everybody can pull it off, and sometimes it becomes stale and predictable. But in those early years, while filmmakers across the globe were trying to work out the basic steps, a handful of outstanding films began to explore its possibilities within the genre. 1931 saw the release of two massive hits in America, Todd Browning's Dracula and James Whale's Frankenstein. Then in 1932, European audiences were given Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire. I'm going to save Frankenstein for a future video.
Where should we be if nobody tried to find out what lies beyond?
So for right now, let's look at the other two. On paper, they have a lot in common. Both plots pit their protagonists against vampiric enemies. Both are loose adaptations of 19th century novels written by Irishmen. And both drew inspiration from the same 1924 stage adaptation of Dracula. But how they approached the dance of silence and sound couldn't be more different.
I can imagine.
Yes. Whose carriage? Count Dracula's.
It's hard to overstate how important Dracula was in the history of horror cinema. Its massive success in the middle of the Great Depression kicked off the now legendary universal horror cycle of the 1930s. Its star, Bela Lugosi, became an instant icon.
I bid you welcome.
And his version of the Count remains the definitive vampire of pop culture to this day. But in terms of how gracefully the movie navigates this new realm of sound, I have to compare it to this. For starters, except for a bit of Tchaikovsky during the opening credits, the film has no score. Its most horrific scenes play out against an eerie quiet. Lugosi creeps forward with a predatory slowness that rivals the monsters of the silent era. The total silence makes it almost unbearable. Would you just bite her already and get it over with? Yeah, that part of the movie is pretty great. But the lack of score also emphasizes the sounds that we do hear. And as the film progresses, this means an increasing amount of dialogue instead of action. Van Helsing drones on and on and on about vampires and how to defeat vampires and how to recognize a vampire when you meet a vampire.
And then I saw
Mina narrates her
two red
horrible
eyes
nightly
staring at me,
visitations on the morning
and
after.
a white, livid face. came down out of the mist.
Characters argue endlessly over their next move. Worst of all, the film's climax takes place off camera while our attention is dragged away to more important things like, oh dear God, more conversation.
We thought he'd killed you, dear.
Some of this can probably be blamed on the source material, a 1924 stage play adapted from Bram Stoker's novel. Given the limitations of live theater, it's likely that this version also relied primarily on dialogue to move the story, and the epistolary format of the novel meant that someone was always narrating the events from the vantage point of the aftermath. That probably didn't help either. But I do think the majority of the fault was Universal's. Browning had to ask permission for every special effects expenditure. And the studio held the budget in an iron fist, so he had to do pretty much without wherever he could. Now, maybe the studio heads were just really anxious about this being Universal's first all-talking horror picture. Maybe they thought the best way to emphasize the talking part of that was to minimize everything else as much as possible. I don't know. Seems like a poor decision to me, but on the other hand, audiences were enamored of the talkies and they wanted more. So if Universal was trying to respond to that demand, can I really blame them? Anyway, speaking of audiences, a minute ago I was complaining about Van Helsing's endless monologues about the vampires and the vampires and the vampires. As much as it can feel sometimes like he's beating that horse well past the point of gravy, it's important to remember that in 1931, the vampire wasn't the pop culture icon it's since become. And these lectures, they were probably vital exposition at the time. I mean, how else could the audience understand the stakes? Thank you. A lot of the creative decisions that went into Dracula don't hold up very well today. In the middle school dance of Silence and Sound, it's that one dorky kid doing the chicken dance in the corner while everyone else is slow dancing to I Don't Want to Miss a Thing by Aerosmith. But the movie has its moments.
Isn't this a strange conversation for men who aren't crazy?
If nothing else, it gave us Dwight Frye's incredible performance as Renfield. And that alone is worth the price of admission.
Rats! Thousands! Millions of them!
In a lot of ways, Vampire is Dracula's mirror opposite. Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer was originally inspired to make a vampire film after observing the popularity of that same 1924 stage adaptation of Dracula. But the screenplay draws more heavily on the ephemeral, atmospheric stories of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And where Browning had to fight Universal for every dime, Dreyer made his vampire movie without the aid of any studio. The entire production was bankrolled by Baron Nicholas de Gunsberg on the condition that he got to play the lead role. So Dreyer was free to make the movie that he wanted to make without any creative interference. The result is a surreal cocktail of vampires, occultism, and nightmare imagery that left initial audiences scratching their heads, or even booing. But it also shows a sophisticated, though idiosyncratic, understanding of the possibilities of sound. Unlike Dracula's all-you-can-eat conversational buffet, Vampire's sound is more of a seasoning. Part of the atmosphere. Half-heard voices cry out from adjoining rooms. Evil laughter rolls like thunder in the night. Voices call to one another from across a silent river. Conversations fragment.
Kind. Es ist kein Kind hier.
The story passes at an oblique angle, only partially visible to us. An unaccountable dread permeates the whole picture. It reminds me of Maya Deren's 1943 short film Meshes of the Afternoon, or maybe Twin Peaks. And that's the thing. Wampir retains many of the trappings of silent cinema. The emphasis on light and shadow and camera effects, the use of title cards to enhance mood and fill in narrative gaps, a story propelled by action and imagery instead of dialogue. But somehow it feels ahead of its time, almost modern. Despite being Dreyer's first foray into talkies, Wampir shows an elegance and maturity in its soundscape that puts many of its contemporaries to shame. True, it's not for everyone, but in terms of the dance between silence and sound, it just might be the prom queen.
Thank you. I enjoy learning new things. What is a horror movie again?
Don't worry about it. Listen, I'm getting pretty tired. Can you hold down the fort while I get some rest?
Scanning idiomatic language database. Responsibility accepted.
Thanks, buddy.
Rest well and recharge.
Chuck? Why are they looking for you?
Madam Undersecretary. He's not here. No sign of Asset 974X either. Yes, ma'am. Understood. Thank you, ma'am. Do you speak English, weed puller? I said English. Habla de potato, English. Waste of time. They're not here. Move out. Do you have any idea what you're suffering for? No, of course you don't. Pathetic. This is better than you deserve.